Welcome everyone. Pleased to see that so many people are attending this webinar today. My name is Bart Brinkman from Bridge Legal and Finance. And today Bridge is hosting this webinar on recruitment, onboarding and Dutch labor law jointly with Adams Multilingual Recruitment. Adams Recruitment will kick off the seminar with their part on recruitment and onboarding, followed by a short Q&A. Then Bridge will take over for their part on Dutch labor law, also followed by a short Q&A. Well, let us not wait any longer, and I would like to give the floor to Edina and Jennifer of Adams Multilingual Recruitment for their interesting part. Please enjoy the webinar.
Hi, good afternoon everyone, and thank you for that lovely introduction, Bart. Bart, I would like to ask you now to please mute yourself, and then we make sure that we also don't have any feedback on the presentation. Perfect. Now I think we can move on. So first of all, a quick introduction on Adams. Yes, we are a multilingual recruitment agency specialized on the international market in the Netherlands. We actually started our organization in 1997, so we are more than 20 years on the international job market in the Netherlands. And we have currently 2 offices in Amsterdam and in Rotterdam. And as Bart mentioned, we are doing this webinar today in the collaboration with Bridge, who are actually specializing on legal and finance services. They are also specialized on the international market in Europe, actually. And they were established in 2011 with the merger of 2 companies. And they, as you can see, they have not only offices in the Netherlands, but also in the US. As for myself, so my name is Edina. I'll be the first presenter of this webinar today. And as I have 7 years of recruitment experience, I'll be focusing mostly on the recruitment part of the presentation. So starting with a bit of job market trends and then continuing with the selection and hiring process. This will have a joint traditional recruitment / remote recruitment as well. And then afterwards, my colleague Jennifer will take over and she will talk to you further about onboarding, tips and tricks on onboarding, what works, what doesn't work. And also once you made the perfect choice and onboarded your candidate, or now your employee actually, how to keep them motivated and make them a successful employee for your company. At the end of our presentation with Jennifer, we will have a short Q&A. So make sure to ask all your questions already during the presentation. That's why we have a dedicated Q&A part actually on the webinar. So please feel free to shoot all your questions there. And for now, I'm going to also switch off my camera so you can completely focus on the presentation, but I'll be back with you once we start with the Q&A part. All right. So to begin with, as I mentioned, I have 7 years of market experience now in the recruitment, which means that I started working in recruitment in 2013, when actually we were very much deep in the recession. So it was a complete company-driven market with not so many jobs available, but with a lot of job searchers, a relatively high unemployment rate, and quite a lot of candidates looking for jobs. As the market started recovering, the economy started recovering, and companies started expanding again, this trend started slowly switching to a more candidate-driven market, to the point actually when in March 2020, we reached a record low unemployment rate in the Netherlands with 2.9% only, which I believe is a tremendous change. And the good thing is that this change happened quite gradually over the course of 7 years. So of course, when we talk about 7 years of change, and actually even longer if we consider what happened before 2013 as well, then the recruiters and the hiring managers had a lot more time to gradually adjust themselves to a new market situation and to the new market trends. However, with what happened with COVID-19 at the end of last year and the beginning of this year, this was a very sudden and drastic change to how companies operate and how companies do their work nowadays. So I believe I'm not alone, and it wasn't only Adams, the only company that had to go through this massive rapid change when one day to the other we just packed up our computers and our equipment and we just started operating from our homes. And I believe there were quite a lot of companies doing the same and following this example. So of course, there was a switch and a change in that sense that we started hiring and onboarding remotely. But unfortunately, the virus also impacted greatly the job market. There were more industries that were heavier impacted, for example, the tourism industry or the hospitality industry. But luckily, there were companies still hiring and onboarding remotely. The following parts of my presentation will continue with the recruitment process, actually. Part of it will be applicable to remote hiring, but actually some part will be applicable to a completely traditional recruitment process as well. For instance, when we talk about the selection process, as I mentioned, as we went more towards a candidate-driven market, we had to start looking at a modern way of assessing a CV and assessing someone's skills. So previously, when we talk about a company-driven market, companies had the competitive advantage of being extremely selective. So they could just pick a CV that was 100% matching a job description or a job profile that they had in mind and make a match, and that was it. However, as candidates became a scarcity, we had to start looking into transferable skills and competencies. So there were a lot of people who made a more lateral change, so not necessarily growing vertically in their positions, but switching departments, switching to other jobs, and actually with the help of their transferable skills and competencies, they made extremely valuable parts of certain companies. Proactivity and continuous learning became a must, actually, when we talk about hiring talent, which in my opinion is really great because, yeah, as I said, it's not always about what you see on the CV, but also about the attitude and the motivation and the ambitions of a person. So how can an agency help you with the selection, actually? So as we are the first recruiters talking to the candidates, of course, after understanding of a client's needs or what exactly would be fitting for their team, for their company culture, for their job, we make the first assessment of the candidate. And often we talk to people who actually are completely lost in their job search. We can give them advice on what could be the best fit for them in a direction, but also with understanding our companies and our clients' culture and fit for their team. Sometimes, as I said, on paper, we talk to candidates that are not 100% matched, but with their ambitions, with their transferable skills, they could be an extremely valuable part of a company. So that's why we truly value our relationship with our clients, because we try to really assess of what could be a good fit for them. Moving on to video interviews, and I'm going to talk about video interviews now because, yeah, of course, with the situation that happened over the past couple of months and probably the coming months as well, it is highly likely that the first kind of interview you will be having with a candidate would be over a video. So my suggestion would be, first of all, is to invest in a good video tool and to avoid any kind of technical problems. So I believe when we all started working from home and yeah, started accommodating to a more remote kind of work process, some companies or most of the companies already invested in these video tools. If you haven't yet, I would highly recommend it, again, to avoid technical problems, but actually it's not only beneficial for an interview process, but also later on for an onboarding process as well, or just in general having team meetings and company meetings, actually. And it's not enough to only invest in a tool, but also teach your employees how to use the tool, because of course, with the help of that, you can maximize yeah, the benefit of this video tool. And don't forget that you as a hiring manager or you as a recruiter might be extremely comfortable talking on a video interview. You might have a lot of experience conducting these kinds of video interviews, whereas your candidate might not. And actually, especially when we talk about working from home, the circumstances can be quite difficult sometimes. Some of us have children at home or pets or kind of, yeah, more difficult circumstances. So I believe in the beginning to make a short kind of icebreaker and just have a chit chat about, you know, setting the right expectations during the call can ease the tension as well and can make the candidate a lot more comfortable throughout the conversation. Also, if you plan to conduct the interview process solely remotely, then I suggest to engage in at least 2 video interviews, just to make sure that you got to know your candidate the most or the best possible way. And also, it's great sometimes to involve other people in the recruitment process just to have a second opinion. And it's also a great way to see how consistently your candidate is answering the questions that you're asking. Pay special attention to the body language during the interview. So as I mentioned, try to treat the whole conversation as if it was a face-to-face interview. So try to pay attention to the facial expressions, how the candidate is sitting, are they fidgeting, are they using any kinds of hand gestures. These are all important part of a regular interview as well as a video interview. And yeah, just because we are working remotely and we are working from home, you should still be respecting the standard working hours. So yeah, I suggest to stick to the 9 to 6 time frame, unless you have an extremely flexible person with no difficult circumstances at home, then of course, by all means. But in any case, especially in the Netherlands, we pay a lot of attention to the work-life balance. So I would stick to the regular working hours for conducting a video interview. So during the interview, you also want to make sure that you make the right choice for the candidate. And of course, as I mentioned about transferable skills and different kind of competencies, you need to assess, especially if in the beginning you plan to work with this person remotely, you need to assess how motivated they are, how independently they are working, and yeah, how proactive they are in their problem solving. So a couple of typical interview questions to ask in order to assess this is, what job did you like the most, the least? What kind of work environment do you work the best in? So with the help of these 2 questions, you can already have a good idea of what kind of work environment they operate in the best. And also it can happen that, for example, what they feel the most matching or the most motivational for themselves is not what you can offer, but at least you can have a transparent conversation about that later on, and you can already address that kind of yeah, problem. Describe a time when you recognize you weren't going to be able to meet multiple deadlines, or maybe even just one deadline. What did you do about it? What was the outcome? Tell me about a time when you went above and beyond your role and expectations. Why did you do this? What exactly did you do? These questions are more focusing on how motivated your candidate is, how independently they are working, when they face a problem, whether that would be a showstopper, or do they ask for any kind of help, especially when they work remotely. This could be extremely important when you need to respect project deadlines, for instance. And also when they are taking those kinds of extra steps and they are trying to be as motivated as possible, whether they do this because it's expected of them or because this is just who they are by nature. One important thing during the video interview is to represent your company and to do your employer branding. So of course, as you do the interview on a video, your candidate is not able to see the office. They don't have the possibility to feel the atmosphere or to grasp the company culture. It's not like they walk in an office and they immediately have a feel for what's happening there. So you need to put a bit more extra effort in explaining what it is like to work for your company. And as I mentioned, do your employer branding. So it is not completely up to you to set those expectations and to really almost sell your company to the candidate. Share experiences of internal events, emphasize all the kind of activities that you do together. For instance, at Adams, we have Friday lunches together, which are always a lot of fun, but often we go out for drinks after work, or we just have regular team activities. We have even with trainings or meetings every month. That's something important to mention so that your candidate already knows what kind of culture they are going to join. And also try to think out of the box. Sometimes you can be extremely creative with these kinds of things. And for instance, just as much as recording a short video of the office or of the team and share it with the candidate can already make a massive impact in the recruitment process. So to sum up, make sure to have a good video interview tool available to conduct the interviews, but later on for your meetings and for your onboarding process as well. Make sure to make your candidate as comfortable during the interview process as possible and pay special attention to the body language. Make sure that your candidate is comfortable working independently and that they are motivated to join your company, and try to do your employer branding and emphasize the company culture. So hopefully now you made the right choice and you can actually onboard someone. So my colleague Jennifer will take over the presentation now. Please bear with us for a quick second until we switch to the presentation, and yeah, good luck, Jennifer.
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen with you, and then we can jump right in. Okay, so first of all, thank you so much, Adina. That was very, very interesting. On my side, before I dive in with onboarding, just a quick intro in regards to myself. So my name is Jennifer, and I work at Adams Recruitment now for almost 10 years, actually 10 years in October. And I take care, I work as an events and training specialist over here. My position's quite varied, and part of my position is actually recruiting internal staff for Adams Recruitment. So I also take care of the onboarding of new staff. Now, to follow up on Adina's presentation, she focused on, let's say, the current market conditions at this moment. She focused on interviewing, and she focused on company culture. And I wanted, again, to dive into the next process after that employee has signed the contract, which is onboarding. So onboarding is actually also known as organizational socialization, and it's actually management jargon that started in the 1970s. Now, some fun facts, because I love fun facts in regards to onboarding. So Glassdoor actually carried out some research on onboarding, and they found out that a good onboarding program actually increases employee retention from up to 82%, which is a whopping amount. Also, on the other side, negative onboarding also encourages new employees, let's say, to leave the company, and they're twice so likely to leave the company. So that is just interesting information to keep in mind, and it also shows how important onboarding is, especially in these times where everyone's working remotely and there's less of that physical contact. Now, in order for you to fully concentrate on the presentation, I will also just turn off my camera, and then we can dive in. Okay, so what is onboarding, first of all? So onboarding is basically a series of activities that allow new hires to know the company's culture and get to know the team. There are actually two ways of, sorry. Oh. I'm sorry, I'm just having a few technical difficulties. So. Okay, guys, sorry about that. It shared the wrong, the wrong slide, and I wasn't aware. Okay, so the typical onboarding. So onboarding is basically a series of activities that allows new hires to get to know their team and learn about the company's culture. There's two actual different ways of onboarding. We have the more formal onboarding, which are meetings, lectures, videos, and printed material. And then we have the more informal side of things, which is, for example, shadowing, coaching, having discussions, chats with, for example, colleagues and managers. Now, onboarding can actually be from just a few weeks to more than 3 months. And again, a survey carried out by Career Builder actually surveyed 2,300 HR professionals and hiring managers, and actually 3/4 say that they use onboarding for less than 1 month. So there's only a 1-month onboarding period there. Now, tips and tricks. First of all, what's really important is that we invest time and we put effort in our onboarding. So, start planning this 2-week plan well in advance. Come up with some informal and some formal tasks as well that you can add into the onboarding. This can be, for example, social interactions via Zoom. It can be chats via Slack, for example. It can be videos, and it can also have, for example, reading exercises. So a nice mix of things. What's also interesting is to ensure that you start a small project. So what I mean by this is when the person starts, just make sure that they've got a nice small project they can work on. This can be, for example, with another colleague where they can share tasks, they can talk. This also means that they have that communication going on, even though they're working remotely. Now, another good idea is if you're going to onboard, let's say you're looking for 2 different people in your organization or 3, it's nice to wait and onboard them together. So wait for them to start together. This makes them, again, feel, you know, part of a community. They get to know each other. And I think it makes them feel much more secure. They have someone else to turn to, let's say, that's also new. Another super important thing when onboarding is after someone has finished their onboarding, ask for feedback. Don't be afraid to ask what went well, what didn't go so well. You know, how did they feel? Was it maybe too much information? Was it too slow? You can actually gain a lot of information from this and, you know, make your onboarding even better for the next time. What's also important is, again, that personal connection, okay? Make sure you've got space for that personal connection. Make sure that people are not, you know, scared to call someone else. They have the possibility to chat with their colleagues, etc., even though they're working remotely. And again, on the logistics side, what's really important is to also keep in mind that onboarding often starts even before the first day of the new employee's work. So it's really important to ensure that all the papers are signed, that the laptop, that the phone is ready to go. And what we do, for example, at Adams, which might be a nice gesture, is we already send, for example, a handwritten card to the person before they come into the office. The manager, for example, sends an email to all our colleagues here, all the employees, just to, you know, tell them to add this new employee on LinkedIn, to send little welcome messages, really just to make them feel at home. And another really nice idea, I think, is to send a welcome package, especially now that there's this remote onboarding. It's nice to send them, for example, some little company, for example, a mug or something that makes them feel happy. Now, what works? So in order to make onboarding, you know, right, you need to make sure that the right tools are in place. You need to make sure it works. And Trello, for example, is a great tool that we use here. You can share boards, you can share projects, you can share work with between employees and between managers. Slack is also a nice chat tool that can be used. And of course, Zoom, which is getting very, very popular at the moment. What's also important is when someone is being onboarded, you want to make sure that you have a program in place. So you want to ensure that everyone that's going to be taking part in this onboarding has, you know, scheduled meetings in their diaries. You want to make sure that that onboarding schedule is sent to all the colleagues taking part, so they know exactly what to expect. They know exactly what they're going to take part in. And again, proper handover is important. This new colleague will start, and they'll start remotely. So they need to know, one, how to use the systems, how to log in. All these details need to be in place. And most importantly, if they have issues, they need to know who they can contact for help. Another thing is add reading exercises. For example, the company manual, for example, you can add sections of the company manual in your onboarding program, but just make sure that they know exactly where they can find it. That's really important, that they can refer to it if needed. And also, again, the code of conduct. What's another interesting approach to this, you can also, if you want, set up for example, a Zoom call or a chat between a colleague or a buddy and this new employee, where this buddy can actually talk to them not only about the code of conduct, but also the unspoken rules. Normally, when you're physically in an office, you see more of these unspoken rules. And of course, remotely, it's a little bit more difficult to see. Now, virtual onboarding. So in order to make virtual onboarding go smoothly, what you need to do is just to make sure that all the tools are in place, okay? So make sure that you've got tools for virtual signing, for example. Make sure, for example, the welcome gift has been sent. You can see 2 different examples of welcome gifts on the slide at the moment. You also want to ensure that the employee has the correct links to the training session, so they know exactly where they need to log in and where they need to be. And another important system you can establish is the buddy system. And this is nice because the person starts and they're assigned a buddy, and this buddy is not a manager, but it's a colleague of theirs who, if they have any questions, they've got a name, they've got a contact, and they can reach out to them, not only for maybe work-related issues, but also if they have maybe any personal issues they want to discuss and they feel a bit intimidated by the manager, then they have that person to talk to. And again, yeah, clear and frequent communication, really, really important, especially because it's remote. You can't just walk up to someone and ask them. So it's important that all the communication sent is really clear and concise. Now, normally the first day in the office is a first day where you physically step into the office. And this time it will be a remote first day. So it's important that, your new employee is cared for today. So you need to make sure that they can log into any internal team communication tools that you're using. You need to make sure that the conversations are sort of really easy, they're flowing, they're organized. And what's really nice is maybe that the manager, or for example, HR professional, sends out a small welcome message. Maybe, for example, if you use WhatsApp between colleagues, you can send a small personal message just welcoming this person on board, and also maybe giving a small bio, a small bit of information about your new colleague. What's also nice is to schedule a video call, because again, a video call is a little bit more personal. You can see the person. And if you do that, you can then welcome them aboard. Colleagues can also be part of this call, and it's nice. It's warm. It's a warm welcome. And again, encourage colleagues to also reach out to your new employee. So it's important for them to reach out to their new colleague, and not all maybe at the beginning of the day, but throughout the day, to send little messages, asking them how they are, etc. It makes someone feel really welcome. What's also important is to remember that this remote onboarding might take more than 2, 3, 4 weeks, and it's important to keep this person motivated. It's really, really important, especially because working alone at home might feel a bit lonely, and it's a new company for them. Everything's new. So it's important to make sure that this person feels, again, welcome. So in order to do this, a few tricks that could help, let's say, is to just maybe include small, easy tasks that they can follow. Also, make them feel that they're contributing, and these tasks can help them concentrate on what they need to do. You can also send them, for example, articles to read, podcasts that are also related to work, and ensure, again, with this buddy, the buddy can always help them out. They can touch base, for example, on a daily basis. I know that here at Adams, during our onboarding, we have either the buddy or the manager actually chatting with the new colleague every single day after each day of onboarding. And it's just really informal chat over a cup of coffee most of the time. Now, responsibilities are important here, and it's important to make them feel valued, and it's important to make them feel responsible. So what could be an idea is maybe to give them a really exciting project to work on, and not only to just give the project, but also to explain why this project is important to the company, and also what the company wishes, let's say, to achieve with this project. They'll then feel, they're making a difference, they're making a contribution. Also important to check in regularly. Again, really important, the regular check-in. And it's easy sometimes to forget, but it's really important to check in regularly, asking them also for feedback. How are they doing? How are they feeling? How's work going, etc. Now, just to sum everything up in one slide. So again, 1, start early. Preparation is key here. So make sure you have your plans in place. As we mentioned before, onboarding starts way before the person actually enters the office, or remotely, let's say, enters the office on their first day. 2, ensure the employee can go online with no problems. Make sure everything's set up beforehand. Make sure that they know exactly what to do on their first day of work. 3, employee handbook. It's really important that if they need to find a rule, for example, I don't know how to ask for holiday days or anything like this, that they know where to find it. It'll make it really easy for them. And also company culture, very, very important. It's difficult to see a company culture when you're remote, and it's nice to have a chat with someone to get a feel of that company culture. Create a sense of belonging, really, really important, because you want this person to be happy in their new job. You want them to fit in, you want them to pick up their work quickly, let's say. And again, it's important to look at each onboarding plan individually and have a look at and ensure that you've got, let's say, video check-ins, that the person knows what goals they're working on, that this person has maybe projects that they're diving into to make it, you know, stay interesting for them. And again, professional development, personal development, that they know what they're doing. So if there's any online trainings that you offer, that they can, you know, get their hands into that, you know, keep going. And again, encourage collaborative learning. So ensure that this person feels that they're learning and that they're growing. Anyway, thank you everyone for listening today. What I wanted to mention is we will have now a quick 5-minute Q&A session just for the first 2 presentations that you've seen today. And then after that, we will hand it over to our partners, Bridge. I will just put my slide on for questions, and I will just also add my video. Adina will also join me for this.
Yes, I'm also here. And actually, we already received some questions, so I will already start with the first one that we received. How much emphasis do candidates put on flexibility and working from home at the moment? And my answer is a lot of emphasis. So actually, not just at the moment, but this was a trend already before the whole COVID-19 situation. So candidates appreciated a lot of flexibility on flexible working hours. That was the one thing. So being able to start whenever they can and finishing whenever they can, of course, by filling their working time properly, but also the fact that they can have 1 or 2 days working from home, especially when they're commuting. This was already quite important before the whole pandemic. And another question came in also, nowadays, what are the working conditions candidates feel are very important to them? This depends greatly on the candidate and also on the age group. So if you talk about fresh starters or people who are early in their career, as we mentioned, the flexibility, the working hours, these are important to them, but they also put a lot of emphasis on a fun, young company culture where you can, you know, more like a startup-like environment where you can have a beer with the colleagues, you have a pool table available or darts or whatever. So you can also not just work, but have fun in the office as well. Whereas when we talk about more experienced candidates, again, apart from the flexibility and the working times and of course, when we talk about more experienced candidates, it's highly likely that they have families, for instance, so they appreciate the flexibility to go and be able to pick up their kids from their daycare or anything like that. But for them, having this kind of startup-like environment is not as important as for the younger generations, I would say. I hope this answered your questions.
I can answer one if you want. We've got one here about onboarding, and it says, with remote onboarding, how do you make it consistent and helpful without seeming to micromanage? More difficult, of course, than being in the office. But what I would answer to this is what's important is in an onboarding plan that you've got various members of the team training this person. And they will then go from one person to the other, from the other to the other. And it's always maybe nice to have that end of the day chat with your manager, so that you can catch up with the person, see how they're doing, see what they liked in regards to the day, etc. You can set up Zoom meetings, let's say regularly for this, and it's important to make it maybe a little bit more informal. So of course, sometimes it can be work related, you can talk about work, but it's nice just to ask maybe the person, you know, how they're doing, set up a cup of coffee or a chat, and that will, you're still, let's say, keeping an eye on the situation, but it's more informal, it's more friendly. And I think that will really help the person feel that they're welcome as opposed to micromanaged. I hope that answers that question.
In the meantime, we also had a follow-up question on the working from home bit. Is it becoming more important than the salary? Sometimes, yes. I experienced in some cases that as long as they had more flexibility, it was more important actually to get that kind of flexibility rather than negotiating the salary itself. So of course, it all depends on what kind of profiles we are talking about and what kind of job opportunity we are talking about. But in certain cases, it became more important to have the flexibility to work from home rather than to have a higher salary, for instance.
I have a question here in regards to onboarding by Serena. Hi, Serena. You've asked me, is that better to have the same person for mentor and buddy? The answer here is this new colleague, let's say, would have a manager, and this buddy would be the one, let's say, buddying or mentoring the person. So yes, it could also be a mentor as such, but it needs to be a buddy. Let's say the idea of the buddy is that this person feels comfortable to turn to someone and ask them questions. So the most important thing I think here is that it's not the manager that is taking on a managerial role with this person. It's more a mentor, a buddy, someone just helping them out and showing them the ropes. I hope that answered your question.
All right. So someone says that they heard the rumor that 4-day work week are popular in the Netherlands. Any truth to this? They are actually. A lot of people work on a 32 hours or 36 hours basis because, yeah, it gives them a bit bigger work-life balance, actually. So it's completely true. It's not a rumor. It happens. I have to say, though, without being any discriminative or like, yeah, I don't mean it as a sexist kind of comment, but it happens more with women actually, as they would like to stay at home 1 day with their children. But it's actually quite popular to have even like a papadag, so for dads to stay at home 1 day a week actually and take care of the kids as well.
I have another question over here from Reynard. A challenge that I have faced with onboarding is getting managers to take the time out of their busy day to give some personal attention to a new joiner. Any tip to get manager to recognize the importance of this? This is a difficult one. I mean, the most important thing is I think that the managers understand how important the onboarding process is. It's really important that this person is trained properly, feels welcome, and especially now that they're all remote, it's really important that the manager realizes how important the personal contact is between them. So how do you get someone to recognize the importance of this? I think maybe as an HR professional, you can have a onboarding plan that is sort of standard throughout the company, where maybe instead of this person diving into work straight away, there's time set up for the managers, for the staff, for the team, where they can, sit down and help train this new person on board. I think it's also, a mentality thing. I think onboarding is maybe also a pretty new thing, especially with some facts I saw out there state that 90-day onboarding is the most effective onboarding, and 90 days seems really, really long to onboard someone. So I think here the trick is basically, especially during this remote time, that managers really need to understand that this person's remote, and at the end of the day, the more attention they have at the start, the longer they will stay with the company and the longer they will stay in their team. And I think it's really important for a manager to spend that time. I hope that helped.
So I'm really sorry, but we will have to finish the QA session now. We will need to hand over the word to Bridge. Thank you for all your questions. The ones that we couldn't answer now live on the Q&A part, we will answer them in writing to you. So don't worry, you will get an answer to all your questions. If you have any further, please feel free to still ask them in the Q&A part. We will stay online with Jennifer throughout the presentation with Bridge as well. So if you have any further questions, we are happy to answer them in the meantime. But for now, we will hand over the word to them. Thank you for all your attention.
Thank you for your time.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Adina and Jennifer, for giving all these tips and tricks about recruiting and onboarding. I will be talking to you a little bit more about the legal side that comes in between the recruitment phase and the onboarding phase, because before you start onboarding an employee, from a candidate, someone becomes an employee, you need to tick some boxes on the legal side of it. And what I would like to talk to you about is the employment contract, the different types we have in the Netherlands, and also some terms and conditions that are important to be aware of, and finally how to end a contract if needed. And my colleague Esme will take over after that on the right-hand side of topics that you see on the slide. Just trying to see if we can have the correct screen. My apologies if it's taking some time. Apologies. So this is the second slide I would like to discuss, or the first slide on employment law. So in order to get a candidate onboarded, we really advise to have an employment contract in place with all the terms and conditions that you have decided on in the recruitment phase. And this employment contract is regulated by labor law, and it is important that that the labor laws are mentioned in various laws and regulations. So it is important to know where to find them so that you can actually make sure that you tick all the boxes there as well. In addition to that, it could be possible that the company that the candidate is going to work for, so the company, falls under a collective labor agreement as well. And a collective labor agreement is an agreement concluded between unions and employers' organizations. And if such a CLA, a collective labor agreement, is applicable, there could be terms and conditions in there that you need to take into consideration apart from the Dutch labor law. This aspect is too big to go into too much detail. It would be a webinar by itself. So just please note that there is a possibility that such a contract is applicable as well. Although not mandatory to have a written contract in place, it is very highly recommended. If you have a verbal contract, which is also legally binding, there could be discussions about the content later on. So therefore, we highly recommend to put all the agreements, all the arrangements in writing in a contract. And some provisions are even only valid if they are concluded in writing. So that is very important to note. I have listed them below. So the fixed term employment clause, indicating that you only hire an employee for a fixed term, has to be in writing. If you have a verbal contract and you have not discussed that, an employee could claim that they're on an indefinite contract. So be careful with that. In addition, the probationary period, a period in which an employee can be terminated, needs to be agreed upon in writing as well. There are different terms, 1 month or 2 months, and the duration of the probation period depends on the duration of the contract. A non-competition clause, that the employee cannot work for the competitor after terminating or after leaving the company, is also only valid in writing. So please do note, have an employee contract in writing between the two parties. Then there are different types of contracts that you can offer the candidate. You have the fixed term contracts or an indefinite contract. A fixed term contract can only be offered to a new candidate because there is a maximum of contracts that are to be offered and a maximum duration that can be offered. So the amount of contracts that can be offered fixed term to an employee is 3. And it cannot exceed a maximum duration of 36 months. Please really note this 36 month. It is important as it has been a recent change in the law. As per January 1st of this year, 2020, it has been extended again to 36 months. It used to be 24. So maybe if you use Google or do some research about Dutch labor law, you still see the 24 month, but it has been extended. If you offer a fourth contract, this contract will automatically become an indefinite contract. So always keep in mind, if you do not want to do that, that you calculate the duration carefully. And for two contracts to be consecutive, it is important that there is less than 6 months in between these contracts. So if you have, for example, employed someone for 36 months, and then this person wants to take a nice trip around the world, and they will stay away for 7 months to do that, and they come back and you want to offer them a contract again, you can, and you start again with a first fixed term contract if you want to. That is a possibility. An indefinite contract is the alternative. Is also possible to offer straight away to an employee. You may do that, there are no restrictions. However, it is important to note that if you have an indefinite contract, you of course do not have an automatic end date. We will get to that in a later sheet. But it could be, for example, part of the negotiations. If an employee is leaving a very good job and wants to join your company, they could say, I am only going to accept employment with your company if you are offering me an indefinite contract. So it could be something that you want to consider. Some benefits are that you do have a possibility to give a longer probation period to agree to such of 2 months. So the first 2 months of the employment would be considered a probation period then. Another benefit is that you pay, the company pays a lower tariff for unemployment benefit premiums to the during such a contract. A contract does need to be in writing in that case, so make sure that the payroll has a written, signed, indefinite contract in order to apply the lower premiums. But what goes into this contract? As I mentioned before, the terms and conditions are mostly regulated by law, or at least the law states minimum entitlements for certain terms and conditions. But for the rest, the employer is quite flexible to offer certain terms and conditions. And an important one is vacation days. There is a legal minimum or a legal entitlement to 4 times the employee's working week. And that is maybe a little bit difficult to calculate, but to give an idea, most employees work full-time, 40 hours a week. That means that they have 160 hours per month, 20 days a year, or 160 days hours a year, 20 days a year as a legal entitlement. And these days you cannot deviate from that. You want to have the employee take these days as much as possible. They are meant for recuperation, to really get energy, get energized, back to work, go on vacation, go to that beach with the picture show, and rest. So that is the reason why the law also states that if you do not take them in the year you accrue them, you could lose them. They lapse 6 months after the year they were accrued. So all the days, the legal vacation days from 2019 would lapse after July 1st, 2020. Then there is also a possibility to offer extra legal entitlements to employees. This is not mandatory, but it is a decision, a choice. Unless, of course, you are bound to a collective labor agreement, there could be deviations, so always check that. But otherwise, you are free to offer extra legal entitlements to employees. These days can be moved forward for 5 years. And even though not mandatory, it is quite industry standard to offer some days on top of the 20. And most companies give between the 23, 25 days in total. In addition to this, a lot of companies also give the public holidays as paid time off. This is not obligatory or mandatory either. However, it is quite common to give the public holidays, such as Christmas, New Year's, but also some really national holidays here in the Netherlands, such as King's Day, Liberation Day off. So it's approximately 7 to 8 days a year. Something that you might not be too familiar with as a company if you have, if your company is from abroad, is vacation payment. So on top of the vacation days, in the Netherlands, it is required to also give 8% of the annual gross salary to the employees to actually spend on their holidays. So not only do they get the days, they also get some money to do fun things with that. And this amount is, the law states that it must be paid out as a lump sum, ultimately in June. Most often it is paid out in May. But if you want to, you are allowed to deviate from that. You can, for example, also choose to make the salary inclusive of this holiday allowance and pay it out every month. Or you can agree to a higher percentage. That is not very common, but it is possible. The 8% is the minimum. And only in case the salary the employee receives is more than 3 times the minimum wage, you can agree to not pay it out. However, all these 3 points need to be agreed upon in writing, otherwise they are not valid. What is very important, and that's why we have indicated it as a tip on the sheet as well, because you're not used to it maybe, to really negotiate, or not negotiate, but communicate if the salary you are discussing, negotiating about, is inclusive or exclusive of this 8% vacation pay. If you don't mention anything about it, and you hire this employee, for example, for 50,000 gross a year, and then later the employee can claim, well, that amount was excluding vacation pay, so I am still eligible to this payment. So be careful and be clear about your intentions there. Well, we have been talking about recruiting, onboarding, and everyone always wants to have an employee on board, of course, who stays with the company for a long time and really is a good match to the company. And even though many are, there are, of course, sometimes situations where it is not a good match, or maybe due to business economic reasons, the company has hired a couple of people and at a certain time cannot no longer sustain employing these people. Especially during these times, of course, companies are struggling and sometimes there's no other option than to terminate the contracts. So there are different ways to terminate a contract here in the Netherlands. And I would like to use these last 2 sheets to explain how the fixed term contract is ended and how an indefinite contract is ended, because there are some differences there. For both, but especially with the fixed term contract, it is always good to first check, is there a probation period? As I mentioned before, it needs to be in writing in the contract. And of course, you need to be quite at the beginning of your employment to still be in that period. Usually it's only 1 month, maximum 2 months. So if you are still in that period, it is very easy to end the contract by just giving notice with immediate effect. During the fixed term contract, however, it is a little bit more difficult. The first step here is to check if your contract includes a premature termination clause. This clause indicates that you are allowed as an employer to prematurely terminate the contract before the end date. So if you have a contract for example, 1 year, and you would like to terminate it after 5 months, first check if that is even allowed. If that is allowed, you have options. And the options depend on the reason for the termination. So you at all times need a reasonable ground for termination. And the reasonable ground could be from a business economic perspective, a reorganizational aspect, or maybe underperformance or a disturbed working relationship. And in the Netherlands, unlike some countries, you need upfront permission to end a contract. So for underperformance, you would have to obtain a decision from the court to be able to end the contract. And if you have business economic problems, you would have to go to the employee insurance agency to receive a permit to end the contract. So it is not possible to unilaterally end the contract by just giving notice. So first permission and then end it. And to end it, you need a good file. So you need a reasonable ground, but you should also have enough substantiation to make this reasonable ground to convince a judge or the UWV that there is no other option than to terminate the contract with the employee. With a fixed term contract, it is always good to see how much time is still left on the contract. If you have a 1-year contract and you only have 3 months to go, it would be more beneficial for the company to just wait until the end date of the contract comes around, because it automatically ends on that date. You don't have to end the contract proactively. What you do have to do is to notify the employee that you are not renewing the contract. And you need to do that 1 month before the end date. That is very important, because if you do not do that, the contract will still end. However, you could, the employee could claim a penalty. Also, if you do renew it, you have to inform the employee that you are renewing the contract 1 month before again. And in addition, you have to indicate the terms and conditions under which the contract will be renewed. And for an indefinite contract, the grounds are actually the same as for the fixed term contract. So I won't be repeating them, but make sure that you have a reasonable ground for termination and that you do receive upfront permission from the court or the UWV. The notice period will then also still be applicable to come to an end. And the length of this notice period is dependent on the duration of the contract. So the law states that if an employee has been employed by the company for less than 5 years, there's a notice period of 1 month. 5 to 10 years would be a notice period of 2 months, and so on. It goes up to 4 months. So it is important to know the longer the relationship has lasted, the longer the notice period will be. Deviation here is also possible in the contract, but then at all times, the notice period of the employer side is always twice as long as that of the employee. And you might think, well, that is quite difficult to obtain permission from the UWV or have a court decide that I can actually end the contract. So do I really need to go there? And the answer is no. About 80 to 90% of the termination cases are settled amicably. So that is a positive note. But what we do always advise is to have that underlying file in place, because an amicable settlement can only be reached if the employee consents to it. So all the terms and conditions need to be in this settlement agreement, and the employee must agree in writing with this termination. If they don't, you still end up going to court or the UWV. So have your file in place, and then you can always discuss it with the employee first and try to reach mutual agreement. Important note, apart from the notice periods that need to be taken into consideration, is that when an employer ends the contract on their initiative, the employee has a right to a transitional payment. So that is something to keep in mind as well. So this is the information I wanted to share with you today, and I will now ask my colleague Esme to come and join us and share her knowledge about the HR side of the employment. Thank you.
Okay. In the meantime, I saw that lots of questions have come in, which is great. I've just been trying to answer some of them, and Felina will now look at which ones she will pick out to answer when I finished. But also, if you have questions about my part, then do not hesitate to put them into the Q&A, and I will answer as many as possible afterwards. And if not, it will be in a written Q&A, which is sent out to you afterwards. My name is Esme Storm, and I'm HR Business Partner at Bridge. And whereas Felina has talked about the contract, and we've already heard from Adams about the recruitment and the onboarding, I will be talking about some of the obligations that you still have as an employer after that, which are important because they are a part of the employee journey. And it means that in order to make sure that your employees are still enthusiastic about the company after their onboarding period, that they are well dealt with and that you have their best interests at heart. So we're going to be talking about the very exciting subject of health and safety compliance. I know probably a lot of people think or a lot of companies think that they are actually compliant with all the health and safety rules and regulations. So I thought it would be fun and interesting to see how many of you are actually aware of that compliance and how many of you think that your company is compliant with the health and safety rules. So we'll go first to the first slide. So I started up a poll. Or I will start up a poll, and then you can answer whether you think your organization is compliant with the Dutch rules on health and safety. That's the so-called ARBO-wet in Dutch. So I would just launch the poll quickly now. It'd be great to see as many. Another 13 seconds. See that we're getting there. If you haven't voted yet, please feel free to vote yes, no, or I don't know. %78% have responded. So I'm going to stop the poll there then. The others are still thinking about it, so maybe we can count them as I don't know. Ending the poll now. I will share the results with you as well. Quite interesting. So 68% of you think that your organization is compliant with the health and safety regulations. 31% do not know, which is understandable because if you're a hiring manager, you may not know what your company has behind the scenes. You may not be aware of what the obligations are. I will certainly be looking at those obligations briefly with you now today and just going through them with you. And after I've done that, I would like to do the poll again to see how many of you still think that you're compliant, or if there's one of the little letters, the small letters at the bottom that have caught you out and actually your organization still has some work to do. So moving on, if my computer will work with me. Yes, so the health and safety obligations. There's a number of obligations. These are the most important ones. Depending on your organization and the risks that you run as an organization, there may be additional rules and regulations. Also, if you fall under a collective labor agreement that Felina spoke about, that might mean that you have extra health and safety requirements that you should comply with. So the first thing is that you have to have a contract with an occupational health and safety service, which sounds really posh in English, is actually what they call in Holland is an arbodienst. So that's a qualified party who can advise you about health and safety, and it's the organization normally where your company doctor is employed by. So if somebody is sick, you send them to the company doctor. So if you know that you get a check done on you when you were ill, for example, then your company has an occupational health and safety service. Also, just to divert a little bit to another subject, all of these points are mandatory. And each of them separately can be fined if you're found not to be compliant. The fines are generally between a few €100 and 1,500 to 3,000 euros, something like that. So you may think that's not a big deal, but do bear in mind if somebody is to have an accident, for example, which could have been prevented by compliance with these rules, and they end up the rest of their life in a wheelchair or even worse, your liability could be huge. So it's really good to make sure you've got, you can tick these boxes and that you have gone through the motions. So the first obligation was the health and safety service, the arbodienst. Following on from that, each company is obliged to have a policy about health and safety. That might include drug policy, so saying whether alcohol and drugs are allowed in the workplace or not. Sometimes alcohol is, drugs generally not. And also an anti-harassment policy. So that's a policy which details what an employee can do if they are experience stress or harassment or bullying in the workplace, and a complaint procedure for that. Quite often these are included in an employee handbook, which we at Bridge often draft for our clients, with a lot of other procedures and codes of conduct, as we heard about at the beginning, that it's good to have an employment handbook, just detailing what the rules and the regulations are within the company. So this would always be included in that, but even if you do not have an employee handbook, then you do need to have these policies. In fact, if you get to my fourth point, the risk inventory and evaluation, if you do not have them in place, that will come out as an audit requirement or recommendation. Okay, we're not there yet, unfortunately. The next step is to appoint a prevention officer. Dat is een preventiemedewerker in Dutch. You have to have an employee, a prevention officer within your staff, your local staff, and that's somebody who advises management on health and safety related items. So that's the person that would be saying, I don't think it's very safe how we have this situation. I see that there's wires hanging out of the wall. I really think you need to do something with that. It's also the person who would conduct the risk inventory and evaluation, which is the next point, but also the action plan. And it's the person that would keep an eye on the action plan to make sure that it's being executed. I would like to emphasize that the prevention officer is not the final responsible party for health and safety at work. So you cannot fire somebody who is prevention officer because they have told you that you need to do something. They have the same kind of protection as like a member of the Works Council, for example. So it's good to bear that in mind. This person then would proactively have a risk inventory and evaluation performed. Quite often we work with partners, for example, who can give you a questionnaire that you fill in about your workplace and about your company policies in the area of health and safety. And then you look at that, look at where the gaps are with the legislation, and then you would come up with an action plan with timelines as to how quickly certain things should be addressed. As you see on the slide, this also has to be validated by an expert. So that's somebody often at your occupational health and safety service, or it could be a private company, but it does have to have a sort of stamp on it that it's been done properly and that it's a real, it's a good reflection of the actual working situation. There is an exception to that if you have a very, very small company with less than 40 hours of employed work per week in your company, or if you fall under a collective labour agreement, there are sometimes pre-arranged RI&Es for that sector, and they don't have to be validated then separately. But generally, you would always have to have it validated. Once you have it validated, that plan is relevant and is validated for a period of time until something big changes. You need to look at it every year. Update things, see where there's new risks, make sure everything is working as normal or as it should work. But you only need to have it revalidated at such a time that you move office or you take on a big new machine or there are significant new risks at the workplace. In relation now to the corona crisis, the corona measures in your office or in your workplace should also be mentioned in your RI&E. So even if you do have one, make sure that also covers your rules for the office and the measures that you have taken to be corona proof. That's very important. Also, something coming out of the RI&E, the risk inventory and evaluation, is that you need to also appoint and train some emergency response officers, BHV'ers in Dutch. So they are people that are able to respond in case of a fire, but they also have to respond to first aid problems at work. So if somebody has an accident, they are the first person that's there, and they're also able to empty the building, evacuate the building if there is a fire alarm, for example. There's special training for these people. We always recommend, however small your company, to at least have 2, just because not everybody is in the office all the time. So you always want to really ensure that you have 1 present at all times. The training for this is generally takes 1 or 2 days to start with, and then has to be refreshed every year. The costs are quite limited, just 200 or 300 euros per person for a day training or 2 days training. So that's quite reasonable. It could be, if you're in a shared office space like WeWork or other, it could be that you don't need emergency response officers because other companies in the same building have already organized them, or your landlord has already organized them. But it is still your responsibility. So you do need to check that and make sure you have it in writing that, for example, your landlord actually does have a plan in place. Now the last one, and this is the one I think that will catch people out a little bit, is to offer a preventative medical examination every 3 to 5 years. So every employer has to make sure that their employees are not suffering unduly due to the work environment and the working conditions. For office workers, that means, are your eyes still okay because you work a lot on the computer? But it could also be you work with asbestos. Have you not got any lung problems or things from that? Or in a noisy environment, if you're working in the streets, digging up the street, and you've got a pneumatic drill with you the whole time, then you might suffer damage to your hearing. So every employer has to offer their employees a preventative medical examination, and the period in which you do that, every 3 to 5 years, will depend on the risks as detailed in your risk inventory. The preventative medical examination, the law is not very clear on exactly what it has to entail. So what we see and what we have organized ourselves with a partner is that we offer a simple online questionnaire which is sent to all employees, that they can answer questions about their lifestyle, their stress at work, their working conditions, and automatic report rolls out. But you can also extend that with a physical examination, with an eye check, maybe not known to all of you, but if you work more than 2 hours a day on a computer, or your staff do, you do actually have a responsibility to refund the cost of an eye examination every now and again. But also they could check your blood sugar, your blood pressure, all kinds of things depending on your own needs as an organization and depending on the risks in your risk inventory and evaluation. So they're the most common steps that all need to be taken as a good employer, and also one that wants to look after his or her employees. So I would be interested to know now, after what I've just told you, actually, how many of you still think actually that you are compliant. So I would just like to put out the poll once more and have you answer that, just for us to also check if our feeling is correct. I think a lot of companies do not offer the preventative medical examination. So if you've been at your company for 3 to 5 years and you've never heard about it, then that's a sign that they're not doing it. Which isn't unusual, because an awful lot of companies do not offer it, but it is something you could flag to your HR department. So I'm going to relaunch the poll. Just a quick recap on the scores before was 68% said yes and 31% I don't know, and only 1% was honest enough to say that they weren't already compliant. I'd like to see how many of you still think that you are compliant. So here it's coming. I'll stop the poll there. Not everybody has voted, but I'm sharing the results now with you. As you can see now, the percentage that thought they were compliant, which was 68% before, has now gone down to 39%. So as you see, there really is some work to be done within the different companies. And the 1% that said no has now become 39%. Rest assured, the poll is anonymous. I can't see who answered what, but I think it gives an interesting indication that we often assume that we are compliant because nobody has complained, and actually to really do health and safety properly, you need to think about these things and check that they're being done in your organization. And certainly all the more so now in the corona time and the post-corona era, you know, we really need to make sure that our working places are healthy places to work. And again, partly because of liability, but also because your staff are important capital for you, and you need to make sure that they stay in good health. That then brings us to our following topic, which is sick leave management. Oh no, sorry, I added a slide at the last minute based on some questions actually that we received from you. Regarding the corona era now that we're in, and the fact that people are working more and more from home, some companies are actually choosing to scale down completely in their office space and have people working from home. So the question rather arises is, what is your responsibility as an employer with remote working? The easy answer to that is the employer is responsible for the working space of the employee and has to offer a compliant working space. That means if you close your office or only have very limited spaces in an office space, that you're also responsible for the employee's working conditions in their office at home. That also means that you're responsible for the costs that are incurred in making it compliant. So if you say to your employee, you have to work at home, I cannot offer you an ARBO, working conditions compliant working space in the office anymore, you have to work from home, but you know that your employee is working on a laptop from the kitchen table, that you would really need to look with that employee and say, okay, do you have a space in your house that you can use? Can we supply you with a proper chair, a desk that you can adjust in height? Can we provide you with a screen to plug your laptop in? I know the laptop working is very, very popular, especially amongst those of us that are slightly younger, maybe the millennials and before then. But actually, if an employee is working more than 2 hours a day on their computer, then they should not be working on a laptop. However, before you're all kind of thinking, oh no, I'm going to have to you know, set up a whole office space for somebody at home and everybody, and it's going to be lots of costs. If you can offer a place at the office, so you say you're welcome to come to the office, but you're also welcome incidentally to work from home if you so wish, then you have fulfilled your obligation because you are offering a good, safe working space for the person to work. I would advise if you start now working from home more, whereas before it was maybe very, very sporadic or very, very incidental, to implement a proper policy or working from home or working remotely, remote policy. In that, I would advise to make sure that you have make clear and have the opportunity to actually change or cancel the policy. So nobody can actually claim rights from it. So if you decide at a later date for that particular employee that they're not doing very well working remotely and you want them to come into the office, that you can actually just retract the policy for that person, or else also retract it for everybody if you need to, or adjust as applicable. Though you cannot actually give the employee the responsibility for their workstation because it is your responsibility. But what you can do in that policy is to state that the employee promises that they will take care of a good working station at home, that they will take note of the regulations, and you can even provide the regulations to them. So tell them how their seating should be at home, how their lighting should be, and that there's a few minimum requirements in order to be able to work from home. That will help to cover you as an employer slightly more and share the responsibility with your employee. So we recommend to sign a checklist where they physically say, yes, this is in order, and then sign for it. And really you should check that every so many years or every few months or whatever, but make them look at it again and to confirm that they are in compliance. The last point I think I already mentioned is that you need to inform your employee about what safe and healthy working looks like. So what do they have to have in their house, and how are you going to help them? What kind of reimbursements are you going to offer, for example, if they have to work from home? And I believe the person that actually asked this question also asked, well, what happens if you're working overseas? So maybe you have an employee from Portugal, he or she has gone back to Portugal for this period to be near their family. They're working from Portugal on a Dutch contract, but working for the Dutch office. If it's only a temporary situation, you can suffice with these rules, making sure that you know that they have got a good and safe working space to work in. But if it's a structural thing that you're actually going to employ somebody that lives in Portugal all of the time, it's possible that you might also fall under the rules of the country itself, but that really depends on the rules in that country. So you would really have to look into that to make sure that you comply not just with the Dutch rules, but also with the local rules. So I hope that explains a little bit about the remote working and health and safety. The important thing I think to remember is the separation between have you offered a good, sound working place to your employee? If there is no alternative and they have to work remotely or from home, then you are responsible as an employer for that working space. It's important to document that in a policy also, because you will be able to tax deduct some of the costs afterwards if it is in your original plan. So I mentioned before we will move on to sick leave. Sick leave brings an awful lot of obligations with it, unfortunately. Of course, we would wish that our employees don't get sick and that they just work 100% all the time, but unfortunately that doesn't always reflect the reality. I would like to emphasize how important it is to prevent sick leave in the first place. Sick leave can be incredibly expensive. It says on this overview, 200 euros a day. I actually read an article in the week saying about the average for small and middle-sized enterprises that it actually costs more like 400 euros a day to replace your employee, but also to pay continued salary costs and all the things that you have to do. You have to pay for them to go to your occupational health and safety service. So it is an expensive endeavor. Once somebody is off sick, you're actually kind of too late. So try and prevent it where possible. It's important to prevent it also just to make sure that there's good onboarding and good induction, because that makes sure that the employee is feeling good about the company that they work. And a lot of the time they will choose to work even though they are maybe feeling sick. So if you wake up with a headache, one person will decide, you know what, I'll go to work anyway because I've got lots to do and I love my work. And another will think, oh, it's a good excuse to stay in bed. So sick leave is a choice in some cases. So it's important to make sure that your employees are engaged, are motivated, that you have short lines with them. Short lines, speaking of that, actually when people register sick, it's also very good to make them do that personally by telephone, because that makes it that little bit more difficult than sending an app or a Slack message and saying, I'm sick, I'm not coming in today. It's good to make them realize, well, no, actually, you've got to get up still early. You've got to ring me before a certain time. That can help to prevent sick leave. Hopefully all of you know this already, but the obligation to pay sick pay for employers is for up to 104 weeks, so 2 years, Obviously, if they have a fixed term contract that ends sooner, it ends at the time that their contract is not extended, presuming you do not extend it. But if you have a permanent employee, for example, and they stay sick for 2 years, you are required to pay them a salary. Their salary is limited at a maximum salary, but even so, it's still generally a high amount. It's 170% of their last salary, up to a maximum of around 57,000 is used as salary, which the employer has to pay for those 2 years. On top of that, you have any costs of any interventions and anything else that you need to do in order to try and get the employee back to work. For smaller companies and for bigger companies with high absence rates, it can be interesting to take out an insurance to cover you for the salary payment during sickness. But even then, it's still incredibly important to make sure that you prevent sick leave by staying in dialogue with your employee as much as possible. Know what's going on with them, support them where possible, but don't become their therapist. Is a tip that I would give you. And really, if people are frequently ill, make sure you discuss that with them, taking in mind also the GDPR restrictions. So you may not really ask what is wrong with somebody, but supposing you have a young and fit employee who's been sick more than 3 times a year, then you can say, wow, that's quite a lot for someone who seems so fit and healthy. Are you okay? Is there anything, going on? Can I support you in any way? Generally, that's received really well. Occasionally not, but in any case, however it's received, it does have an impact on the frequent and short-term sick leave. And about frequent and short-term sick leave, I would say as well, that's usually a little bit of a red flag. Quite often that precedes a period of longer absence. There's a reason that somebody is ill every 2 months for 1 or 2 days. It could be that they're working too hard and that they're giving it their all, and they need to recover from that, in which case you need to look with them about how to use their energy better and spread it over the week or reduce the stress that they're experiencing. But it's very often a sign that there's something else going on, and especially if the employee does not confirm the reason for the sickness, that there is no medical complaint that's causing it. So be very, very alert of frequent and short-term illness. So I mentioned it already, we have all these obligations. There's very, very specific rules in the Netherlands. So we actually stand by and help a lot of our clients with sick leave management, because you do have to appoint a case manager anyway. So we do that. If you do not manage your sick leave process well, and that is well according to the judgment of the Employee Insurance Agency, the UWV, then the UWV can decide that you are liable to pay a 3rd year's salary. So it's really, really important to make sure you do everything that you can as an employer whilst the employee is sick to get them back to work. Apart from the fact that it's very expensive in the first 2 years anyway, but also because you don't want to receive an extra penalty and have to pay a 3rd year of sick pay. So the first thing you need to do when somebody is sick is to register them sick with your arbeidsdienst or the Occupational Health and Safety Service. I think probably, well, I know a lot of our clients indicate, yeah, but that person was only ill for a day, so I didn't bother register them. Unfortunately, that's not permissible. You do have to register people at all times, even if it is only for 1 day. And falling back on what I said about short-term but frequent illness, it's good to have a good record of all those loose days in between. In addition, if somebody becomes long-term sick, but they were actually sick for just 1 day in the 4-week period before that, then that means that your timeline moves to the earlier date, so the date of that 1 day of illness, and then your 104 weeks counts from that moment. So it's important to make sure you have a record of that. If your employee is likely to be sick for, say, more than 2-3 weeks, you need to nominate a case manager. That is somebody who will undertake the direct contact on behalf of the employer with the employee. Now, there is some confusion about case managers because quite often an occupational health and safety service also have a case manager on their books that has contact with you, but that's not the same as the case manager on the side of the employer. The case manager has to make sure that an action plan is set up and is followed and that all the steps are taken on time. So they advise both the employee and the employer about what needs to be done. And that is an example of one of the services that we offer at Bridge from our HR department, is that we act as case manager. And that can be really, really useful to have somebody who is neutral, because quite often you have people that are in a conflict with each other, or there's underlying tensions, and it can be really good to have an external case manager, so just who knows what the process is and knows what things to look out for. It also means we have a shorter line to the ARBO-NED or to the ARBO-Dienst, the Occupational Health and Safety Service, so we can also quite often realize more where we can push and influence a little bit more on what the company doctor, for example, asks the employee. So if we think that there's a suspicion that there's actually a conflict going, we can make sure that the company doctor asks that. And most employees do not have a straight line to the company doctor, unfortunately. Now, my last point on this slide I already shared with you, so we shall move on. That brings us to our last slide and our Q&A. So feel free to keep putting your questions in. Felina is going to come first and answer the questions that she's been looking at while I've been talking to you. And when she has finished, I will pick up a few and come back online. Thank you for listening, and keep coming with your questions. And thank you for attending today. If you do leave in the meantime, also look in the Q&A, because we have answered quite a lot of questions online in the chat as well. Thank you, and yeah, I hand over to Felina.
Hi, well, thank you for being here still. I'm just going to look if I can see the questions in my screen, because I've been looking at them already in the meantime. And we have received quite a couple of questions, and I will be answering a few of them. The first question I will be answering is, can a verbal offer be legally binding, or is the contract the only one that matters? This is a very important question, because a verbal offer is legally binding. We see it often, especially with clients who have their main office, parent office in the US, that you are used to using offer letters. Sometimes an offer letter is followed by a contract, sometimes it isn't, but please be careful with that. Any verbal offer, any verbal contract is legally binding. In the Netherlands, it is if an offer is accepted, there is a binding contract. So please be sure if you do that, maybe not all your terms and conditions have been agreed upon, and that is why we really recommend to have a contract in place and not have an offer agreement before that moment. I hope this answers your question. Then we have some questions about the UWV procedure and the settlement agreement. I think there were 3 questions which are about the same. So I will try to answer all 3 of them at once. If you reach mutual agreement with the employee, then you do not need permission from the UWV anymore. What we sometimes do is we start a UWV procedure, and in the meantime try to reach negotiation or reach agreement with the employees. If the moment you reach agreement, you can revoke the UWV procedure. But if you don't reach agreement, you already have started the procedure, and that will save you some time in the end. A fixed term contract, that was one of the other questions, may also be terminated on mutual grounds. So it does not have to be an indefinite contract, it can also be a fixed term contract. However, with fixed term contracts, it could be the case that the employee makes a certain calculation in his head that if we are not reaching agreement, it would only be 3 months left on my contract, so why would I agree to an earlier termination? So that is the reason I mentioned that usually it is always good to first look how much time do you have left on the contract, but try it, of course, to reach mutual agreement. Then we had also a question about the transitional payment, because that is due when the initiative to end the contract is from the employer side. And the transitional payment is 1/3, the calculation of it, roughly 1/3 of the salary that the employee is receiving. So you take the monthly per year worked. So if you have a monthly salary, you take 1/3 of that, and then every year the employee has worked at the employers, that is calculated by that factor as well. But it is the monthly salary plus the vacation allowance plus sometimes also like average of commission or bonus. So it is important to have the correct numbers to work with. And there was also another question about the transitional payment that there was, let me see if I can find the question. Yes, the question was, I believe a new law is in place that employees on a fixed term contract are still receiving such a settlement agreement or transitional payment if the contract is terminated early. And that is indeed correct. This law has changed recently, also at the beginning of this year. Before, an employee had to be employed for 24 months before he or she would be eligible to this transitional payment. But as of this year, this is from day one of employment. So even if you terminate a contract during his or her probationary period, maybe after 2 or 3 weeks already, a transition payment is still due. So do take that into consideration. Another question in regards to termination, that was a good question because I did not mention that indeed. I talked about the UWV and about the court, that a unilateral termination is not possible. That is correct in the sense that it is not possible to just give notice to the employee. So it is not possible to say, taking into consideration your notice period of 1 month, I will end your contract on, for example, August 1st. That is not possible because you need upfront permission. In exceptional circumstances, however, we call that an instant dismissal, dismissal on urgent basis, it is possible to, on immediate effect, terminate an employee's contract. This is usually done if you catch an employee stealing, theft. That is a very common ground or common reason for instant dismissal. But please note that the legal side of that is very strict. So there is a possibility, but in that case, we really do advise to seek legal counsel before taking that step. Let me see. Then there was another question I would like to answer live about the vacation hours. The question, I'm just going to see if I can read it aloud. Yes, is there an expiration date for claiming back unused days after the termination of the employment agreement? Let's say an ex-employee claims that they were entitled to X days paid out upon termination because they were not used. If the ex-employee makes this claim 1 year after they leave, is the employer still bound to pay these days or have these expired? They do not expire. So the lapsing I discussed before, that is to calculate the accrual that an employee still has a right to. So for example, if my employment ends on August 1st, we use that accrual and the lapsing of the legal and extra legal vacation days to calculate how many days I would still be eligible for payout. If the employer at that moment does not pay them out to me, I have 5 years as from that moment to claim them. So there is an expiration date, that is correct, and that is 5 years after the end of the employment agreement. Then I have 2 last questions I would like to answer. One of them was about overtime. That is a topic we did not cover in this webinar, but I would like to answer it anyway. How does overtime work in the Netherlands? Is it paid or time back? And is there a maximum number of hours per week that a person can do? The first section of that question is how does it work? It is not obligatory, mandatory to pay out overtime. There are options to do so, and we advise to make a clear policy how overtime is then either paid or paid back in time, so time in lieu. Both are possible, but it is important to be clear what the options are, and also if it is time in lieu, if that time will lapse. You could, for example, say you get time for time, however, you have to take that time within 3 months period. So have a good policy in place on which you can fall back to. And there is not a maximum amount, a number that a person can work overtime, but what is very important is that this is not on a structural basis. The moment an employee is asked to work overtime continuously for example, 10 hours a week for a long period of time, they could claim that their working hours has increased by these amount of hours and they have a right to payment for these hours in the long run. So overtime should really be on a very flexible basis and should not become structural. Then you should just increase the amount of working time the employee is employed for. Then the last question I would like to answer, I'm just going to see where it is, was about vacation allowance. And the question was the 8% and what is it? And the 8% is, let me just see where it is. So it is indeed the reference or it was compared to a 13-month, and you can indeed compare it to a 13-month. It is 8%, which is about a month of salary, and it is structural. So if you agree to pay, or you are obligated to pay it, unless deviation was possible due to the 3 times minimum salary that was paid out, you have to pay it every year. So you can compare it to a 13-month. And it is indeed 8% of the annual salary. If you, for example, also give bonus payments, it is good to include in your policy that the bonus payment is already inclusive of the 8%. Otherwise, employees could claim that the 8% should be calculated on top of that amount. So these are the questions I had time to answer, and I would like to ask Esme to pick up some of the questions that came in regarding to the health and safety aspect. And thank you so much for your time and joining us today. And I hand over to Esme now.
Okay. Yeah, great to see that there's so many questions come in. So obviously we have to choose which ones we can deal with now and which ones are maybe the most generic and most relevant now. A couple that I picked out, if an organization has a history of employees having nervous breakdowns, is there anything the ARBO deans can do to improve the situation structurally? Certainly, if you see that there's a high amount of people who are registering sick due to stress complaints, should we say, nervous breakdown is maybe could be different per country to country. I think here they would tend to say a burnout, but they also say stress-related complaints is probably the more generic term. You can certainly discuss that with your ARBO deans. In fact, you could organize preventative medical meetings with your ARBO to discuss why you think that might be happening. You can have them come in and they can do research on why that is. You could have them filling in a PME to indicate, are people experiencing high levels of stress, for example. And if you have more than 15 people in your organization that participate in a PME, a preventative medical examination, you can also ask for a report to be discussed with you by the ARBO to indicate where the trends are, where the blocking issues are. So then they could tell you, well, actually 100 people, 100 of the 120 people told us that they experience stress-related complaints. And then you could look with your ARBO deans, with your occupational health and safety service, for example, to offer workshops to your staff on how to deal with stress and to recognize when they have positive stress and when they have negative stress, because you do have both. So definitely, please do discuss with your ARBO deans. That is what they are for. I hope that answers that question. I'm just scrolling through. There's so many questions, and my question was quite a lot earlier, I think. Somebody asked that they're alone in the office. Are they still required to have a BHV or an emergency response officer? And the answer is yes. As soon as an employer has staff, they have to make sure that they are able to empty the building and to give people first aid. They're also responsible for their visitors. So even if you work alone, you might have visitors in the building which you also need to look after. So that one employee who is in the Netherlands in the office, they could be the emergency response officer, but it might be that you also have somebody else in the building from another company that could be that for you, but you do need to document that properly. Let me just have a look at one more question then, I think. Yeah, somebody said, is it still 70% of the wage that you have to pay during the 2 years sick leave? That is quite correct. By law, you have to pay 70% for the first 2 years. I'm guessing the question came because I said you're allowed to pay a maximum of 170%, because what we actually see is that, especially in IT and in most of the corporate kind of companies, that quite often more is paid than the basic 70%. So you often see first year 100%, second year 70%. And variations of that. So also in CLAs, you see variations of that. But it depends what's in your contract. On that note, I would say that there's a lot of companies that maybe at the beginning, when they first started, especially if it's international companies in the Netherlands, they said, okay, we will pay the statutory sick pay, which is 70%. And actually they couldn't be bothered to actually administer that for somebody who's only off for a day. Because that's quite a lot of administration. So in their practice, they haven't actually been doing the 70%, they've been doing 100%. That can cause a precedent. So later on, if somebody is long-term ill, they might say, yeah, but I always received 100% before, so I thought that our policy was just 100% in any case for the first year. So we really advise you to change that in your policy and to make it known to your employees. We help a lot of our clients to do that, to make sure it's clear what the rules are and that you don't form a precedent by paying more for short-term leave, for example. If you still want to cover a period of short-term leave, you can also say the first month would be 100% paid, and after that would go down to 70%, just to give yourself a little bit of a leeway and to relieve yourself of extra stress on the, or yeah, administrative stress. Somebody also asked if there's a limit for the number of employees to consider if an insurance for sickness is needed or not. No, there's absolutely no limit. So from one employee already, you can do it. I think the more relevant question is, how is your company funded? If you've got a big mother company that, you know, can cover your costs of a sick employee, if you only have one employee and they are sick for a year, can you cover that, or is that going to make you go bust? I think they're much more important considerations. So really looking at what is your situation, what would happen if somebody has to be paid for a long amount of time? And yeah, can you pay that? If not, it could be interesting to take an insurance, and we work together with permanent insurance brokers, partners who can help you to conclude such an insurance. That's all the questions that we can deal with now, unfortunately. We will be answering them afterwards in a document, which will be sent around to everybody. So I hope you found this informative and useful. If you have any questions regarding health and safety compliance, sick leave, GDPR, employment law in the Netherlands, then you know where to find us. And likewise, if you need any help with recruitment and onboarding, you can contact our colleagues at Adams Recruitment. Our details are on the screen. Thank you for joining us. I hope that we will maybe be able to give more of these webinars, maybe also physical seminars once we have enough space for that with the Corona ruling thanks for your time and attention, and yeah, have a good day further. Thank you. Ja. Ik heb er wel makkelijk van.
Gewoon seminar.